Now, when we purchase US Enzymes, we've talked a little bit about some of the enzyme products. We talked about some of the master supplement products with the probiotics, and we really haven't even touched on fiber yet. But let's get to that a little bit later. But the other part that came with it was Tomorrows NutritionPRO. That's an association with Tile and producing some branded ingredients. And there's a number of products that we have that came with the purchase, and SunBalance is one, Cranxym is another, Sulforaxym is perhaps one of my favorites. And then since then we've created new products like Immunoxym. Youthzyme is another product that we brought in. Can we talk a little bit about each of those products sort of separately? And let's just start with what the creator, Dr. Kelly Halderman, calls the chill pill.
The chill pill. It's a nice little tagline.
Yeah. It's called SunBalance. It's PEA, quercetin, and luteolin.
So, I mean, this formula, the minute I saw it, I went, well, that's for the neurological system. It's an incredible way to regulate inflammatory and immune processes in the brain, because we have neurons and we have astrocytes and microglia. We have incredible amount of potential ways to raise inflammation in the brain, and you might ask, well, why do you want to do that? You want to keep those neurons, which are very fragile, intact. The brain is mostly fat. It's about 60% fat, and a lot of it is fragile DHA and polyunsaturated fatty acids that, if exposed to the wrong stimuli under the wrong conditions, can cause a lot of neurological damage. And we see the rise of things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even depression and anxiety. All of those can correlate with elements of the brain that are not working as optimally as they should.
So this is a product that you can take to help manage that, but also it's going to have some impact on histamine regulation too, correct?
It is, and that ties into the same conversation, because anytime you raise histamines, histamines are a very powerful biological signal of the inflammatory process. So histamines come up in response to some kind of trigger or stimuli, which will direct immune cells to produce other pro-inflammatory cytokines, and the goal of that is to try to eradicate or rid that fragile area of the threat that it's sensing. But ultimately, if you don't have a way to manage those, which the luteolin and the quercetin are really good inhibitors of histamines, and the PEA is a very good down-regulator of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, the resolution can't take place, providing that you've actually, eradicated the source of origin of the problem.
Oh, that's great. Another product, it's called Cranxym. It's the active polyphenol, if you will, in cranberry, plus nattokinase.
It's a very interesting formula.
Yeah. Where would you use this product?
Well, and I'm going to butcher the word because I can never pronounce glomeruli properly, but the kidneys are what filter the water balance in our entire body. And most people assume, well, cranberry, UTI, bladder infection. And you know that there's some kind of microbial colonization in the urethra and the kidney filtration system that shouldn't be there. But the interesting thing about Cranxym is it pairs a very powerful, well-researched form of cranberry extract with a special form of nattokinase that has really good inhibition of bacterial colonization of the kidney. Because bacteria should be in very specific places of the body. We are in symbiotic relationship with our bacteria. There's the term the holobiont, which basically looks at us as the organism that's part of a superorganism with trillions of bacteria that inhabit our gut, all over our skin, our ear canals, our sinio-respiratory systems. But if these bacteria become problematically imbalanced in specific areas of the body, or they find their ways into specific areas of the body in populations that are too high, then they can cause some sort of dysregulation of how that organ functions.
Let's talk a little bit about the cell danger response.
Cell danger response is quite possibly the coolest thing that I've seen in the last 5 to 6 years of research. So, in a nutshell, we are essentially a grouping of cells. And I love Dr. Brian Walsh's depiction. It goes from cells to tissues, organs to organism. So what affects the health of an individual cell, and each cell has its specialized functions, but at the basis, every cell has the same basic needs. Energy in, energy out. Waste, nutrients in, waste out. if that cell is under threat, there is an evolutionarily conserved mechanism called the cell danger response, which is a way for that cell to fight off the threat, find a way to survive, and defeat its opponent, for lack of better description. So that cell danger response can be triggered by an infection. Could it be viral? Yes, likely. Could it be bacterial? Yes. Could it be environmental toxin? Yes. Could it be physical trauma? Yes. The receptors in the cell have very specific compounds they look for that once that compound binds to the cell, it's a signal to basically say, okay guys, all hands on deck, we're under attack. How can we overwhelm this threat to allow us to return to the manifestation of being healthy cells? So the cell danger response is likely the driver of a lot of what we see in the chronic degenerative cacophony of things that exist nowadays that can be inclusive of cancers, autoimmune conditions, neurodegenerative disorders. Things of that nature likely all have the same or similar mechanisms at play that the body just can't compensate for forever, and then they manifest as a symptom. You might see that as the way someone feels, or you might see something on a test that shows an abnormal elevation to say there's something that's not able to be contained here. And when that symptom is able to play out long enough, you have the manifestation of what I call the ceremonial naming of different disease states that we call type 2 diabetes or something of that nature. So the cell danger response is likely implicated in the chronic health pandemic that we're seeing in modern society.
Right. So Dr. Pankewich, Eric Pankewich, describes it this way: if you are in your home and you have a small child and they're in a high chair and they're eating their Cheerios and making their little mess of whatever they do, and you're over at the stove and you're cooking something and there's a threat to your house, you don't stop to turn off the stove. You don't stop to take the food off the burner. You run right to your child to protect it. We as humans have three choices when we're threatened: fight, flight, or freeze. Some people will just panic and freeze and don't do anything. The cells respond the same way: fight, flight, or freeze. So if we look at a pathogenic organism, many times they need iron to proliferate. That's why lactoferrin is such an effective product for people to take. So if a cell is being attacked or challenged by a pathogenic organism, needs iron, do you think that cell wants to keep iron in that cell? Where iron belongs, by the way, in the cell. It pushes it out into the bloodstream so that it's protecting itself. The same thing occurs with how hormones are treated, how sugar is treated. The cell does not want to replicate. The cell does not want to eat. It only wants to fight, flight, or freeze. And so this response is going on. And then there's a lot of, now this is where you get into your part, the biochemical pathways that are going on inside the cells and how they can protect themselves. And where a product like sulforaphane is going to have an impact on, let's say, the Nrf2 pathway.
Yes, so the Nrf2 pathway, for all intents and purposes, is our epigenetic, so it's a genetic transcription factor that can be influenced to up or down regulate, that increases our antioxidant capacity. So if our body's oxidatively stressed, it basically means that the inside of us is rusting, and that oxidative stress is in response to that threat. So, a cell will go from a power plant to a battleship. Maybe that might be a good way to look at it. If it's under threat, it wants to fight for its life. So it's going to change how it allocates all kinds of energy resources, and it's going to signal itself and localize cells to follow the same trend. So the manifestation of the problems that happen with the cell danger response is we become excessively inflamed. The Nrf2 B pathway, the nuclear factor kappa B, gets upregulated because the body's essentially saying, well, I'm under threat, and what fights off this threat is inflammation. So I might as well get better at raising inflammation because that's the current condition that I need. The issue, though, is if that goes on long term, an inflamed tissue is a degraded tissue. It's like if you had a fire in the house, it's never going to increase the structural integrity of that house. It's going to weaken it until that house falls. When that house falls, that's the disease state. So certain compounds that we have access to and certain approaches clinically can be the specific points of intervention to inhibit that Nrf2 B pathway by regulating the teeter-totter of the Nrf2, pushing it up so the internal rust that the body's experiencing can essentially be shaken off, and you can begin the process of healing again, provided that you've addressed what triggered that cell danger response properly in the first place.
Okay, then I look at the cell danger response in a couple of different ways. Number one, stress, all of these things, we need a little, correct?
We need the appropriate amounts for the positive hormetic effect.
Right, because let's just say if you stop using this muscle, it's going to atrophy and it's not going to work. So it
Yes.
needs to be exercised every once in a while.
Correct.
So your inflammatory system needs to be exercised. All your responses need to be upregulated, downregulated, balanced, and that's what the body is really good at. So when you have a little stress, you learn how to manage that, then you can handle a little more stress the next time it comes along. Whereas if you have no stress in your life and all of a sudden you're stressed, you really go,
You fall to pieces.
you fall to pieces and you can go haywire. So this cell danger response, it fascinates me because I'm a microbiologist, small drives the big.
Yes.
You know, there's so many bacteria in our gut that drive everything that we do. Health begins in the gut. It's controlled by the small. The body is a number of cells. It's controlled by the small. And if we don't take care of that, so to me, the cell danger response and looking at it and getting a little more involved in looking at it sort of gives us an clue of how we can look at where the problem is originating and not worry about, all right, so let's just say there's an issue with some particular hormone and then a gland responds. We don't treat the gland because that's just a Band-Aid on the battleship, if you will.
Yeah.
Or
Or
we have to look deeper.
Or you're overriding the counter-regulatory mechanisms that the body's trying to put forth to heal itself.
Right.
We need to look deeper, 100%.
Yeah, and look at the really small. I agree. Well, first of all, let me give a little bit of a plug to Dr. Kelly Haldeman. We talked about the SunBalance that she helped, and the Cranxym that she helped us create, and Dr. Erik Pankewich, who helped us create Sulforaxym. The two of them have written a book.
They're both incredible practitioners.
And the book is called The Thyroid Debacle. And if you want to learn a little bit more about this, I would suggest when that book finally comes out that you get a copy of that book, The Thyroid Debacle by Dr. Erik Pankewich and Dr. Kelly Haldeman. So now let's talk about Immunoxym. Dr. Ian Haldeman, the majority of his practice is autoimmunity.
Which is becoming a really big problem nowadays.
Right. And we don't need to get into why it is. It's just the bottom line. And he had all these different supplements that he was giving his patients, and pill fatigue is a real problem.
Yeah, I was actually speaking with a practitioner yesterday who had a guy taking 24 pills before breakfast in the morning.
If you're like me, you can take 2 or 3 at a time. I've seen other people take a handful, throw it in their mouth, and swallow it without any problem. For me, pill fatigue is a real issue.
And it's also not a complete way of addressing the resolution of a health problem. You can't just pill for every ill kind of mentality.
Right. So Dr. Haldeman took the supplements that he was giving that are aimed at Treg cell production. Vitamin A, vitamin D, K. And the K, believe it or not, there are many forms, maybe as many forms of vitamin K as there are B. But you need to have the right ones, and then there's again that stereoisomerism, mirror imaging, cis and trans. The trans form is healthier for you and the cis form is not. So you can look at a study and say this is not good for you. Well, they used that form. The study shows it was good for you and they used that form. So when you look at studies, sometimes you have to have a little bit of, and look a little bit deeper into exactly what's going on. And then alpha lipoic acid, some green tea extract, EGCG, and some probiotic bacteria. Of course, then now it has that alginate to help get things through the stomach.
Deep delivery system, little plug.
Yeah. Well, always have to plug everything.
Got it.
So this is a product that is all in one capsule.
It is. So it addresses the main problem that is seen at the root of a lot of autoimmunity, right? So autoimmune is basically the body's inability to distinguish self from not self, and it can manifest in a specific tissue of the body, it can manifest in multiple tissues of the body, and it does really tie in with the cell danger response in the context that It's the end result of some kind of systemic cellular dysfunction that cannot be resolved. So one way of helping to manage that symptom is to support the arm of the immune system that can silence the inflammatory insult or bring down the chronic inflammation, because like you mentioned before, we want the ability to raise inflammation at will, but we want the ability to resolve inflammation after the healing has taken place. If we can't, sometimes we need to give the immune system a little bit of a support along the way to push it in a direction that signals the resolution so the healing can finally take place. Inflammation is the first step of healing. So what Immunoxym does really well is, under the conditions of an autoimmune flare-up, usually you have a suppression of T regulatory cells. Regulatory sounds like exactly what it is. It regulates the ability to resolve the inflammatory insult along that line of the immune system, and it suppresses the T helper cells that typically drive the production of high levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, IL-1, IL-6, IL-17, IL-23, and it's this chronic secretion of these that's driving certain immune cells to turn on body tissues, specifically proteins, and it's their attack of that organ that manifests in the dysfunction that is the consequence of chronic autoimmunity.
Yeah, I mean, the immune response, you have cellular, you have humoral, you have T helper cells, T regulatory cells, you have cytokines that are produced in your body here, there, and everything else, and it's a very complex system to manage. And sometimes with people, they'll get an overabundance of a particular cytokine, and that's often referred to as cytokine storm. And you can then, that can be, it could be the real significant issue. And you made one little comment in here, these things or augment things. That's why they're called supplements.
Correct.
They are not curative. They're there to supplement your body's ability to perform. And this is one of the things that we have to be very cautious about, is how we discuss things that are assisting the body or supplementing what's going on, rather than saying, well, this is going to fix it. It isn't. It's helping the body help itself.
The cure-all panacea does not exist. So, the one thing that I'm really seeing in what we're trying to communicate today is that there's a strategic way of approaching all of these scenarios that we've been discussing. And it's the knowledge of how to use a very targeted product in the right context, under the right conditions, with the right reverse engineering philosophy that helps the body work with itself to get back to a baseline of homeostasis, because that's where you have the manifestation of health, and then you have either side of the yin or the yang, the teeter-totter, available to you. It's when you're stuck in one, that's not balance, that's imbalance, and 10 times out of 10, maybe even 11, imbalance leads to compromised health.
And that's the cell danger response in a little tiny package. We need a little information, and then we need to calm it down. And so again, it's, if you're challenged by a bacterium, your body needs to respond, and it's not going to respond with anti-inflammatory cytokines. It's going to respond with inflammatory cytokines. And then once they get things under control, and then your other immune complexes come in and start to manage things, you need the anti-inflammatory cytokines to bring things back into balance. And the focus of what we try to do is to help the body get to that point where, on the teeter-totter, everything is just sort of sitting here. It needs to go this way, it needs to go this way, but it always needs to come back to the middle. So probiotics can do that with a balanced one. You can push it in one direction if you want, but you can always bring it back with another one. And so that's what we're trying to do with most of our products. But let's talk specifically about sulforaphane.
Sulforaphane itself.
Yes.
Okay.
There's been a lot of studies now coming out of Johns Hopkins and other quality schools that are talking about how sulforaphane can cross the blood-brain barrier and what kind of an impact that can have on health.
Well, sulforaphane that we know of currently is the best stimulator of the Nrf2 pathway. So anything that stimulates that pathway has a profound effect on our body's ability to dampen or regulate chronic inflammation. And some other products out there, turmeric's a really good inhibitor, certain nutrients, alpha-lipoic acid, green tea extract, as we mentioned. But anytime something can cross the blood-brain barrier, you know it has a very powerful effect on how it can regulate the inflammation specifically in local areas of the brain and how the neurons function. Because they're very much about the ability to send a message via something like a neurotransmitter, receive that message, and then create a systemic communication response that results in how our nervous system essentially controls our entire body. If there's inflammation in the brain that's excessive, the specific areas in the brain start to become compromised or dysfunctional. And you can see that if someone's walking around with chronic brain fog, short-term forgetfulness, mood dysregulations, anxiety, uneasiness, depressive disorders, something is taking place in the brain that is not able to self-regulate, and we're seeing the downstream response. So sulforaphane's ability to cross the blood-brain barrier might be one of the best targets for regulating the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory teeter-totter balance within the neurological system, or the central command system of this body.
Right. Marvelous. Thank you.
Welcome.